My name is Brian Mayer. I'm a butcher, educator, and writer. Today we're here at Wybrook Farms where we're going to break down a half a pig into cuts that you would see at your local butcher shop. So the first thing that we're going to do is we remove the leaf lard. Leaf lard is the most neutral of all fats, which means it doesn't have a lot of taste to it. Traditionally, it would be used in things like pie crust and stuff like that before the advent of shortening. So right here, I'm just kind of removing a bit of the flank section. This is just sort of a preliminary step. We'll come back later in terms of removing the sirloin section, but that just kind of gets it out of the way and also makes it a little bit easier to pull the tenderloin off. So along with the leaf lard, one of the first things we'll do is also remove the kidney. Kidneys are wonderful. I usually grind them with my grind and put them into sausage. So here I just follow along the lumbar vertebrae right to where it turns into the sacral vertebrae and right into the H-bone. And I just follow along a very natural seam. And you can very easily pull off the tenderloin once you sever those first connections. It almost comes off by hand. So here we're going to remove the shoulder section. For our purposes today, I was counting between the 5th and the 6th rib. And that's traditionally where a butcher hog would be broken. If we were cutting it for charcuterie, we would want to elongate certain muscles. So we would cut between, say, the 6th and the 7th for charcuterie. And what I'll be able to do is basically joint. So I'll be able to remove this section without sawing. And what that does is that helps the life of the carcass. I'm not sawing through something, so I'm not generating heat, which will cause the muscles to oxidize a little quicker. And I'm also not injecting a little bit of the bone dust into the muscle. So now I'm going to remove just a little bit more of that flank section. And you can see back here with that skin, this hog is hung for about 7 days, so it's really dry. So that skin is pretty tough to break through. So I'm just moving it out of the way because what I want to do is expose this last vertebrae in the lumbar section. And what I'll be able to do here is the same thing. I'll use the weight of the animal to joint and not have to saw. And that piece comes off fairly easily. And then so the last cut is to separate the belly from the loin section. And here we want to make sure that we get a nice enough of a tail, a nice enough of a rib bone on our pork chop without cutting our bellies incredibly short. Bellies get turned into bacon. Bacon is a great value-added product for butchers. Everybody loves bacon, so it's definitely within the butcher's best interest to have as much bacon as possible. So these are the 4 primals: your shoulder, loin, belly, and ham, along with your tenderloin, leaf lard, kidney, and the head. And then from here, we're going to break them down into other cuts. So we've got the shoulder section here, which consists of the butt, the picnic, and then a hock and a trotter. Here what we're doing is removing the trotter from the rest of the arm bone. I was planning to do zamponi, but with the skin being as dry as it was, I thought maybe we'd joint the leg instead. So first, the trotter comes off. Then we're going to locate the joint between the ulna, the radius, and the humerus. We'll cut across, and then we'll use the weight of the entire shoulder to break that piece off. And so we're going to saw the picnic and the butt in half right along this natural curve in the spine. You don't want to saw through muscle, so we'll stop, we'll make a cut, and then again a bit of the scapula is still in there. So we'll stop, we'll saw again, make our way through that bone. Once we're through that bone, we'll continue to cut through again. So now we have our 2 sections. We have the top portion, which is the butt, and the bottom is the picnic. So here I'm just removing the spine, and that's a really great cut to use if you are making something like pork rillettes. And so what you would do is you would take those bones along with some fat, some spices, and some alcohol, cook those things down, drain off the fat, peel the meat off the bone, put that meat in a jar, pour the fat on top of it, wait for it to solidify, grab a baguette, and eat. Here what I'm doing is I'm seaming out the longissimus muscle and some of the other shoulder muscles, and I'm just following right along the shoulder blade. There's a very natural seam there that it can just peel right away. And there I'm just pulling off a little bit of that excess fat. That fat will get used in sausage, that fat will get rendered to cook with later, and the skin is really great. We can take skin and turn it into things like chicharrones, or we can just add it to our stock. So here I'm just following this very natural seam, and I'm removing the longissimus muscles, which will make up the copa, from the bottom portion of that muscle, which is the serratus, which will get cut into the pork denver. So here I'm just removing a bit of the scapula that's still left in. Traditionally, this would get turned into sausage. And I think it's really great that we pulled the top half of this section away and used this for steaks and for roasts. And we're really trying to minimize the amount of trim off here. So here I'm just following along the natural seam, and I'm going to remove a little bit of the skin. And what we can do is we'll just turn this into a boneless, skinless pork roast. These muscles in this particular part are pretty tough, so they're going to need low, moist heat to break down all that connective tissue and collagen. Here I'm following the natural seam, and what I'm removing would be what is considered the short rib or spare rib. These I'll leave whole, or what I can do is cut them into individual spare ribs. One of the really great things about pig is every bit is usable. From the blood, from the skin, from all the offal that's allowed to be used. I think that the only one that we're not allowed to use are the lungs, but really everything gets used, and I think that pigs really exemplify whole animal butchery. What I'm pulling off here is something that you don't normally see, and it's the pork brisket. And again, it's just another way to have a sort of more usable, versatile, a slow cooking roast. I'm going to take the remaining section and I'm going to tie that up into a full roast. And here I'm just basically squaring it off, just making it into a sort of a more manageable, useful cut. So here's a breakdown of the shoulder. And now what I'm going to do is trim and clean these cuts in a way that you might see them in a butcher shop. So I'm just removing silver skin. Maybe if there's excess fat, I'm getting rid of it. Maybe if there's some oxidized areas. One of the things that I love to do with hocks is to pierce the skin, and what that's going to allow is some of the moisture to escape while it slow cooks. So that'll get that really puffy skin. Here I'm taking the spare ribs, and all I'm doing is just separating them right between each rib. So that's the pork brisket. I'm just going to remove some excess fat. Again, something that you don't normally see, but it's a fun cut to try. Here we're just kind of removing some of that excess fat, and that'll go into getting rendered, or that'll go into sausage, and then again the skin gets used in stock. The skin you can make chicharrones, which is wonderful and great, but is a long, arduous process. Another great thing that you can do with skin is pet treats, and it's a really, really healthy snack for them. So now I'm working with the picnic that we have left after we remove the brisket. So here I'm scoring it, and I'm going down a little bit into the fat, because what I want is that fat to render and almost self-baste while I slow cook this. And again, I can smoke this, or I can just very easily just put it in the oven at a very low temp and let that cook. It's going to take a substantial amount of time. So this is the section of the shoulder where we removed the scapula. I'm scoring it just to make it nicer visually. And here we'll just tie this, which will keep the shape more consistent so it'll cook more evenly. So we'll take the trotter and we'll split it in half. We'll expose the center of that trotter, and that collagen will render much easier into our stock. Next up, we have all the longissimus muscles, and those are the longest muscle group in the body. And so it'll be the eye in your pork chop, or it is the copa, and that's what we're going to do here is we are going to tie a copa roast, but then also cut copa steaks. So here are the final cuts from our shoulder. Some of these cuts, if not all, you'll find in your local butcher shop. So the next section that we have here is the belly. So here I'm just following along the spare rib bones, long sweeping strokes, trying to leave as much muscle as I can on the belly side and trying to remove the spare ribs in as few strokes as possible. Because the belly, turning it into bacon, is a great way for butchers to have a value-added product. So here I'm just going to follow along the natural seam, and you can see that the secreto, or this abdominal muscle, easily pulls away from the remainder of the belly. There's lots of opinions as to where the secreto comes from. I like to pull it from the belly because it's the most easily accessible and it's got great flavor and a lot of fat. Here I'm removing a little bit of the gland in the flank section. Unfortunately, glands are one of the things that we really can't use, very bitter in taste. So something like this you don't want to have a gland in.
So the main part of the belly would be the bacon. And bacon really is just salt and thyme, and then maybe a little bit of smoke. Belly can be turned into many different kinds of bacon, from streaky bacon or slab bacon, Canadian bacon, or rasher, jowl bacon, so many different kinds of things.
And these are the cuts that you can get off a belly. So next up we have the loin section, which includes the tenderloin. So there's lots of different cuts that we can get off the loin: bone in, bone out, roasts, steaks. So what we're going to do here is we're going to remove this section of the loin from the rest of the loin, which is basically cutting between the vertebrae and then removing all the muscle without having to saw through it. We'll later turn that into a boneless loin roast. So here what I've opted to do is cut a different style of pork chop with the chine bone attached. So I'm splitting between each vertebrae, sawing through a bit of the rib section, and then just following along the natural path of the rib. And so I'll remove a full pork chop with the chine on. And the other thing I like to do with these is leave all the fat on as well as the skin. They have a few different muscles included in there that are going to change the texture, and that texture is going to change the flavor a little bit. So to counter that, nice and fatty with the skin on as well. For the remainder of the loin, what I'm going to do is chine. I'm lining my saw right at the base of the spine, and just a couple of quick bursts. And once I'm through that section, I'll take the tip of my blade and I'll work around each little piece of the vertebrae. So here I'm just following down the feather bones that are on the back side of the spine, and we'll remove the section of the vertebrae. And again, I'll save this for stock, things like that. So here I'm just following the rib bone and cutting through the vertebrae and just cutting some bone-in pork chops. Here the skin will be off as well as the chine bone being off. So this is a part of the loin towards the rear of the animal, back towards an area where there are finger bones and not rib bones. So I've removed the spine and finger bones, I've skinned it, and here I'm just removing excess fat. It's always a balance between too much fat, too little fat. Me personally, I love a ton of fat, but it's something that we slowly have to initiate customers into buying. And then here I'm going to just score it again just for some presentation, and then I'll tie it. And that tying will keep it in a more uniform shape, and that will aid in a more even cooking. So the last part, we're going to tie something that's sort of traditional holiday roast, if you will. So we're going to tie what is essentially a pork standing rib roast. Skin off, leave a good amount of fat on, not too much, and expose or French the ribs. And really this is all just presentation. Personally, I love to leave all that fat and meat on the bone, but for presentation's sake, it looks really nice. So to go ahead and French a bone, first you want to scrape between the bone and remove any of the intercostal meat. So that's the meat in between each bones. And then really, it just depends on how you feel like doing it. I kind of do a version where I scrape off as much meat and then I'll take a clean rag and use that rag to pull off. Some people really want to see clean bones. I think I'd leave some meat on there just because I'm so anti-Frenching things. So here we're going to remove the skin, and again we're left with some fat and some skin, all of which will be utilized. So the tenderloin is the most tender muscle in the body. What that equates to is a lack of flavor. So to help mitigate that, I leave a good amount of fat, or as much fat as I possibly can. But one of the things that we will have to remove is the silver skin. So that fascia isn't going to break down when you roast it normally. Here are the final cuts from the loin that you'll likely see at your butcher shop. So here we have the final traditional primal, the ham with the sirloin attached. So much like we did on the front arm, we're going to do on the rear. Removing the rear trotter is very similar to removing the front trotter. We're going to look for that joint, we're going to look for articulation in the tarsal bones, and we're going to cut around and then use the table to help us separate that from the hock. What we're going to do is we're going to debone around the sirloin. So first we'll remove part of the sacral vertebrae, and then we'll remove part of the hip that's still attached to the H-bone. And what that allows me to do is make sure I just remove the bone and not pull muscle with it. So it's a much cleaner way of removing those bones. So I'll cut between that cartilage, remove a bit of the hip, and then I'll work around the remaining section of the hip into the H-bone, around the femur, and then pull out that section. The H-bone is a fairly tricky bone to remove. There is a tendon that's attached to it. So it's one of the reasons why you don't dislocate your leg. The rear hock is a little bit different from the front arm in that the rear hock has a stifle joint. So it's almost a straight cut through that section. So we'll remove the tibia from the femur by locating an area just below the patella and the kneecap. And that area right below the patella allows us to sever that section very easily. So now we can remove the sirloin section. So we follow right on top of the tip of the femur. And as you can see, we get a much more full piece of sirloin. Great for cutting steaks or turning it into a roast as well. So here's the breakdown of the ham. Next, I'll cut them down even further into parts that you might see in your butcher case. So here again, I'm just skinning and taking off some of that excess fat. We're going to cut some bone-out sirloin steaks. A lot of flavor. There's a lot of muscle groups in there, so that texture is adding to the flavor. I like them much better than a pork chop. So next up we have the ham and the 4 primary muscles that are included in that. The top round, the sirloin tip, the eye round, and the bottom round. For our purposes, first we're going to skin it, leaving as much fat on as possible. You want to see the shadow of the blade underneath the skin, and that's how you know you're getting a really clean piece. So here we're following the natural seam, and I'm just scoring and following right around the femur. There's a very natural seam there that connects the top round to the bottom round, and we'll remove the top round along those lines. So here what we're doing is removing this top cap. This is the gracilis muscle. The cut that you'll see in butcher shops in the beef case, but you can totally use this in the pork case as well. It's very thin, it's quick cooking, and definitely just a great cut for a couple of portions. There's a good amount of fat on it, so we'll trim that off, as well as removing any of the silver skin or fascia on there. So with the remainder of the muscles on the leg, what I like to do here is just debone it. So I'm just following the bone. And then that femur bone is going into stock. So the remainder of the muscles, the bottom round, the eye round, and the sirloin tip, traditionally would either be left together for a ham, cut into cubes for stew, or going into sausage. But I figured the utility of this is that we can turn all of these into really great roasts. I'm going to pull off a little bit of that excess fat. I'm going to pull off the patella, the kneecap, which is still in the sirloin tip. And then I'm going to tie each of these into individual roasts. And what we'll wind up doing with the top round is taking that and cutting cutlets or Schweinsschnitzel. And then the remainder of the pieces that are left on the leg, I cut those up for stew. So when you're pounding the schnitzel, I use 2 pieces of saran wrap, and you want to make sure that you don't hit directly straight down. You want to push away so as not to push through the muscle. These are the final cuts from the leg that you might find at your butcher's case. And then we have the head, which I like to call the 5th primal. So first things I do is I remove the ears. You can leave them attached, but traditionally what will happen is those will get sliced into strips. They'll get cured along with the head and the tongue, and those will get put into the skin and rolled up and cooked along with it. So I'll remove those. What we're going to do here is something that's very typical in charcuterie, which is removing the entire skin along with the muscle from the skull into something that's called porchetta de testa, or fromage de tête. And here I just follow around the skull. I start at the top of the head and then working down along the sides of the skull. So I work in sections. I work one side, loosening it up, and then I'll flip over to the other side, joining them in the middle right around the forehead, and then peel down the snout of the animal. Just like organ meats that people have this sort of negative connotation with head, you know, it has a face. And so I can understand that it makes it really difficult for people to even think about consuming. But again, talking about pigs and their overall utility, it's just so great that you can take every single part of this animal and turn it into food. Even when you're done, the skull has a lot of meat left on it. So you can totally throw that into a pot and that can be your head cheese. And these are the cuts you get from the head. And finally, these are just some of the many cuts that you can get from a side of a pig.